Good morning, folks. Thank you very much for tuning into the news at Ben. I hope you all had a brilliant week. The weather in London has been pretty damn miserable. And I said that in one of the draft clips that I did. I have to often re-film myself doing the news at Ben because I get it wrong and then have to do it again. But I said that in one of the draft clips, and my son, who was he's still sitting on a sofa in the room, looked at me and he said, "Daddy, that's so anti-British to castigate our weather." And I think actually he's fundamentally wrong. Complaining about the weather is part of our cultural fabric. So I have the right to complain about it. Certainly the climate nutcases go on about it, but I do it from a purely traditional perspective. It's been wet and it's been cold. I hope you've had a better time of it wherever it is that you've been. But turning to the news, what are the things that really caught my eye? Well, the first thing that caught my eye this week, and it didn't really make the news like I expected it to, was the shrinking British economy. In October, our economy shrank by 0.1%, which was the second month in a row in which it has shrunk. And another month would mean that 3 consecutive months of shrinkage and the United Kingdom would technically be in a recession. Actually, we've been in a recession for a lot longer than that, because if you were to take GDP as a proportion of the number of people in this country, GDP per capita, it's called GDP per head, actually we've had a shrinking economy for the last 3 or 4 years. And that's partly to do with the anemic growth we've had, but also the massive number of people coming into the country that seems to get bigger and bigger and bigger each year. So GDP per capita has been going down, but GDP itself now has gone down. And the reason it's gone down is twofold, I think. The first is the Labour government signalled way ahead of the budget that they were going to bring in significant tax rises, which brought a halt to economic activity in anticipation of the budget. So that was bound to impact on our economy. And then, of course, when the budget did come out, it was blooming awful. And the risk that we now face as a country with this budget, which, by the way, includes £70 billion of expenditure. Yes, Rachel Reeves went on and on and on about the £22 billion black hole that she inherited, but this budget that she produced has £70 billion of expenditure in it. It's not what you'd expect with a black hole that she apparently inherited. But the real risk with this budget is that it's justified on raising taxes of around 36 to 40 billion pounds by the various means that she announced. Of course, if she doesn't raise those taxes because the economy is shrinking and the economic organism has been adversely impacted, as it has been by her budget, then the borrowing requirement that she will have will go up. As it is, assuming she hit the figures that she thought she was going to hit, there would have been a borrowing requirement between 30 and 34 billion pounds per year. If that increases, and particularly if the economy doesn't pick up, what you might find is a combination of the economy going down, sterling therefore going down, and it has been going down, as a result of people losing confidence in the UK and not wanting to invest in the UK. Therefore, the cost of imported goods going up, interest rates having to stay up, so our economy further weakening because the weight of high interest rates is a burden on the economy, and sterling going down again, and the same vicious circle repeating itself again and again and again, with the borrowing requirement for the government increasing in direct proportion to the weakness induced in the economy by her policies. And that would then result in a sovereign debt crisis for the United Kingdom. And I think we are on the precipice of serious financial problems in this country. And we've been put there by Rachel Reeves' budget. So when it comes to the point that we fall over that cliff, if we do fall over that cliff, and she seeks to blame Brexit for it or some other nonsense, please remember it was her policies that got us to that point. And at that point, we must then demand a removal of the government. So a small shrinkage in our GDP in October, in my view, presages further weakness ahead and significant risk of a collapse in our government's ability to raise debt. That would be very bad for the United Kingdom. Keep a firm eye on that. The other bit of news this week, big news, I think, from the government was its new national planning policy framework, in which they said they were going to build 1.5 million homes this year, over the period of this parliament, and that if local authorities didn't in aggregate build 370,000 homes across the UK each year, the government would step in and set their targets, set the developments for themselves. Well, I read the National Planning Policy Framework, and I'm afraid it doesn't quite achieve what it seeks to achieve. So, for example, it talks about the need to build all these houses, if necessary on green fields. It does talk about going on brownfields first, thankfully, in the pursuit of protecting the environment, but it is also expansive in the sense that it will build on green fields. But in the same breath as saying that they won't let anything stand in their way of building these houses, the document is full of the requirement to comply with sustainable development, taking climate change into account, making sure that trees are protected, that noise levels are not excessive in the areas where these houses are built, or that these houses don't create excessive noise. And so even though they've put a positive burden on local authorities to produce these houses, actually with all the other constraints that have so slowed down house building over the last few years remaining in place, the chances of them hitting this target, I think, are extremely low. What the government needed to do was to remove a lot of the regulations associated with building homes, as well as speeding up the planning process. There are actually lots of unimplemented planning permissions in the country already. What's not happening is people implementing them, developers implementing them. And the other thing that the government, in my view, should have really focused on was repurposing our town centres. Town centres across the United Kingdom have been hollowed out by changing shopping habits, principally by changing shopping habits, but also by business rates being too high, businesses going bust, lockdowns having had a material adverse effect on the high street, and so on. Town centres, high streets are looking very tired, outmoded, and many of them have become places where crime takes place. And what we should be doing is reinvigorating our town centres by building residential, converting, previous offices above shops, and indeed shops themselves, into something that's useful now, housing, for example. But we can't do that because the net zero targets associated with building, the regulations, not the planning permission, but the regulations, are so onerous that it doesn't make sense to do it. So there hasn't been joined up thinking by the Prime Minister on it, and I'd be very surprised if we hit anything remotely close to the 1.5 million houses that he promises over the life of this Parliament. They have to deregulate as well as make planning, as well as making planning easier to procure. And of course, the other thing which we're all aware of is even if these houses are built, the very few of them will be able to go over to British citizens who've been in the queue for ages because of rampant legal and illegal migration that we've got. We now discover that in 2023 there was net migration. Gross migration was about 1.5 million. Net migration was 900,000 people. Well, if there are 3 people to a house, the entire allocation that Keir Starmer would have had for that year would have been taken up by people who came to the United Kingdom. We simply, as a country, can't keep up with the rate of immigration that we've got going on. So we have to be very concerned about the rate of demographic change in this country, not just because of the cultural damage about which I've spoken so much in the past, but obviously because of the massive economic damage and the difficulties it creates for British citizens to get a roof over their heads, for example. And the third bit of news that I wanted to mention this week was the fantastic farmers' protest that took place in Whitehall. Really a superb turnout this week. And the reason I think it's really valuable that the farmers are protesting in the way that they're protesting is not only to protect their interests and the production of food in the United Kingdom, which is obviously critical if we are to be capable of being an independent country. And by the way, it's also very good for all the carbon emission, all those who wish to avoid carbon emissions and so believe in man-made climate change. It's very good to be producing food locally rather than importing it from, vast distances away across the globe. But the reason I think the protest goes to the heart of the importance of Western capitalism is because it's a protest against the dilution of property rights. Those farms belong to those farmers, and the imposition of inheritance tax in the way that Rachel Reeves contemplates is an assault on their property rights, as it is an assault on small businesses who are subject to the same inheritance taxes, as indeed are all taxes that make it difficult for us to hold our properties. Remember, when we buy a property, we buy a farm or we buy a business, we're buying it out of income that's already been taxed. And so when we buy these assets, we should have the right to continue to hold them. And inheritance tax has already done a massive amount of damage to this country. Great estates, great homes after World War I had to be torn down simply because the owners of those great estates and homes couldn't afford to pay the taxes that were levied on them. Huge cultural damage was done to our country as a result of inheritance tax. Huge economic damage, and the government seems insistent on doing it again. And the reason we get this damage is because fundamentally it's an assault on our property rights, which, as I say, is at the heart of Western capitalism. No assured property rights, Western capitalism is undermined, and we don't have the continued creation and protection of national wealth, as was evidenced by the destructions of those estates. So those are the three news items. As ever, I think the damage being done by the Labour Party is so vast that we will inevitably see things get worse, but I think it's going to be so vast that things after that will have to get better. And again, I place great hope in what's happening across the Atlantic. When President Trump comes in, I hope he can set the agenda for strong borders, deregulation of the kind that I was discussing in the National Planning Policy Framework, cutting of taxes, such as inheritance tax and so on. I hope that we can take our lead from what's going to happen across the Atlantic. Thank you very much for tuning in this week. We're nearly to Christmas. I don't know how many sleeps there are to go. I'm not going to count it. I imagine there aren't many children watching this program. But if you're about to go on holiday, have a great holiday, and hopefully see you next Sunday.